this means from a variety of different perspectives. And so it's a fairly informal session. I'll do a little bit of a delightfully witty overview, and then I will pass it through to the various panelists. Pete, did you want to kick things off more formally? Let's pretend you do, I think. If we all have to.
Well, thank you all for coming and allowing us to show off some of the very connected, integrated work we're doing at UTA. As I mentioned, my name is Pete Smith. I'm the Chief Analytics and Data Officer here at UTA. And when we do unit effectiveness plans, if you've been in administration, you know that that's the sort of thing we do. The absolute first goal of my office, we're about 35 data scientists on campus, is to promote a culture of analytics on campus. There are other goals that look much more like productivity and production of reports and some of the statistics work we do, but that culture of analytics is our goal. And one of the things we try to do is think about sharing of talent, sharing of resources, connecting around data, and I think you're going to hear some wonderful examples today of what I think meets the definition of culture of analytics. For example, you're going to hear from Bonnie talking about use of the university's data in her work in the MLS, in the master's program that's unique here. You're going to hear about some work led by Anna and her team that very much benefited from Henry Anderson's work. He's a trained analyst in our university analytics area. So that blending of the business side of data and the operational side of data with the academic side. And I'm going to leave those comments at that. This is one of the most sterling examples of that culture of analytics, and I hope it brings ideas and connections for you in your particular settings as well. So with that, George, I will give the microphone back to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Pete. So I want to just start with a little bit of a random, bit of background. We'll go back to 2011 when we held the first Learning Analytics Conference. And I was at Athabasca University at the time, and we had secured a small $10,000 fund from the government of Alberta in order to host this Learning Analytics event. And as part of that discussion, we had our president at the time, so Athabasca is Canada's Open University, kind of the Canadian equivalent of Open University UK, but we didn't have, obviously, the 100, 200,000 learners, but we still had pretty solid learner population of 30+ thousand, and a lot of what we were doing at the university was teaching primarily, almost exclusively online, with some proportion being distance. Still the good old-fashioned send paper stuff in the mail. One of the outcomes was when you do that, you get a lot of data, right? If it's digital, it produces data. And so we had an early interest in trying to drive how do you make this data serve the needs of the institution, which the goal is to advance and support effective student learning. And so we had our first Learning Analytics Conference kickoff. We were all very pleased. And then the president of the university at the time came over as we were done, and when you do this sort of thing, you expect your president's going to come by and tell you you're delightful and give you a pat on the head. And instead, the president said, "I think we know, George, that learning analytics isn't really going to be a big thing." And so I thought it was one of the oddest ways of post-event letdown. And so the reason I emphasize that is that the way that institutions embrace the use of data is sort of one of the, I'm not quite sure if I'd call it hidden, but it's one of those critical elements in effective learning analytics and learning analytics adoption. I have a colleague, Shane Dawson, who has been working for years to simply get access to institutional data. Because if you are doing research and analytics and you have access to institutional data, you have the capacity to produce and output a quality of report that's much better in terms of holistic and quality of data representation than if you're doing smaller scale, run studies on your own, or in the case of MOOCs where you have large amounts of clickstream data, but you don't necessarily have the full life cycle of a student, namely the student information system related data that a university captures. So I emphasize that just simply to say how critical institutions are and having enterprise-level views on analytics is to the overall success of a university campus and more broadly to learning analytics as a field writ large. So on that note, I'm going to grab a seat. I've asked the panelists just to start, and we'll begin with Jodi, but just to start with a little bit of an introduction, we'll go down the pipeline, their background, what their interest is in the learning analytics landscape, and just sort of some of the things they've observed from being at the conference for a day and then several days of workshops. From there, we're going to try and unpack a little bit. We have two individuals that are involved in our Master of Science in Learning Analytics, but they have very robust personal, professional activities that center around or are at least adjacent to learning analytics, so you'll hear that. Then you also hear the perspective shared from specifically institutional analytics and the need for that kind of an infrastructure to produce a meaningful impact in terms of not just academic publication, but also in terms of influencing learning at a classroom level. So let's start with Jodi.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, George, and with the rest of the panelists. Again, my name is Jodi. I am a master's student as part of the Learning Analytics program, as George said. My background is actually in implementing digital learning interventions in low and middle income countries, specifically in Africa. So I've been implementing and integrating technology into the classroom for over 20 years in many African countries, both in the health sector and in the education sector. So obviously I've learned a lot of different ways that you need to adapt technology in these types of environments. And I had a holistic view of implementing everything from the technology to competencies to instructional design to training teachers. And so I didn't really have the skill set of learning analytics, and with the growth of everything, I wanted to add that to my skill set, which is why I became part of the master's program. And I want to figure out also now how to adapt that into an African context, because the way we're using and doing everything here, we need to adapt it a little bit. So that's part of what I'm working on. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. My name is Boardman. I am a faculty member here at UTA. I have been a faculty member here for, for a long time, for about 20 years in the industrial engineering department. Over that time, like everybody's career, has a trajectory. My trajectory became the assessment person for our program. So in engineering, we have a national accreditation that we go through every 6 years. I became the lead of that, as well as our UEP. And it just became kind of my role that I picked up. And at some point I realized I don't really know anything about this. I'm kind of doing it from experience, and maybe it would be a good idea for me to actually learn something about these things that I'm doing. So, and I am also was at that point where I was in a little bit of a rut in kind of what I was feeling about my career, and this master's program seemed like a really good, two birds with one stone kind of a thing to give me an opportunity to learn some new things and bump out of a rut that I felt like I was in, but also something that would be very useful for my department and my college.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anna. I am a third-year PhD student in computer science, specifically in security and privacy, and I am also a research assistant in health informatics. I have multiple research interests. One of them is concerning social media data and how toxicity can impact users and their mental health and their behavioral reactions on social media. And the other research interest I have is how we can use social media data to help public health officials in public health emergencies, such as COVID, right? So, for example, we are trying to see if we can monitor social media and also get the perspective of people around the vaccinations and how to use social media to reduce vaccine hesitancy in vulnerable populations in the US. And these are the projects that I'm collaborating with Henry. So I will pass this to him right now.
All right, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Henry Anderson. Like Pete mentioned, I'm a data scientist in the University Analytics group here on campus. And we have probably about a third of the rest of University Analytics somewhere in the crowd here right now. Not to put y'all on the spot, but UA people, hands up real quick. Yeah, so everybody with their hand up is going to have a slightly different perspective from me on the things that I'm going to talk about. As a data scientist, I primarily focus on serving the needs of the campus with regards to predictive modeling, natural language processing, and kind of generally just weird, unusual data requests. Most of the work that University Analytics does focuses on kind of the higher level of the institution. We are mostly reporting to administrators, to deans, to department chairs, And while we're starting to push into classroom level reporting, that's still something that's a little bit on our horizon. So we're hoping to make more progress there, but still some distance to cover. I've worked with Anna on a couple of the projects she mentioned, which is part of another thing University Analytics has been working on, which is general analytics outreach capacity to campus. So even outside of a strictly learning analytics capacity and learning analytics lens, we're trying to promote a greater data literacy, greater understanding of predictive modeling, explanatory modeling, and just general use of data to inform research and practice kind of in all walks of life here on UTA. So with that, I will pass this back now to George.
Thanks. So with the growing interest, I think, around how learning analytics might impact parts of the education sector practically, and this came out of a couple of periodic navel-gazing papers that have been done over the years, which really looks at, are we actually doing something that's significant? Does the work that happens in labs and that happens with academics actually make an impact on the ground? Does it improve learning? What's the contribution? Many of you likely have access to a growing suite of tools, whether it is a platform like Civitas, whether it is a larger data legacy platform like SAS, or whether you have some version of startup platforms that you're using yourself. Basically, there's a huge degree of interest in this, but the bigger question is, does it make a practical impact? So I'm going to ask Bonnie to talk a little bit about, at your department level, as you're teaching, as an academic, is this making any difference for you?
So for me, yes, I can say yes. I am also the director of our undergraduate program. So I'm kind of in charge of the curriculum of what we do at the undergraduate level. And I would say, first of all, everything, just from the master's program, every paper I've read, every class that I've had, I write down a list of here's something I've learned that I can implement that would make our program better, potentially. And now I have a list as long as my arm of things that I could do. One of the things that I did do was that I had help with, that I got data from the University Analytics, was to look at how we were advising students, our undergraduate students, how many hours we were advising them to take. We have, like every department in the College of Engineering, has a beautiful flow chart of when you come into the university, here's what you should take your first semester freshman year, your second semester freshman year. It is totally unrealistic. We know that. We know it's totally unrealistic for the number of hours our program is to think that a student should be able to do this. You know, some do, but most don't. So what I looked at was students coming in, how many hours did they attempt and how many hours did they successfully complete? And I looked at that as a breakdown for all of our students, College of Engineering students, for the transfer students versus the first time in college students, because there's a big difference there. UTA actually has a very large transfer student population. And we advise them exactly the same. And they're not the same. And there were some drastic differences in what the number of hours passed versus the number of hours that they took. I also looked at underrepresented minorities versus non-unrepresented minorities, again, from the College of Engineering lens, how many hours they took versus how many hours they successfully completed. And what that led me to do was to change our flow chart. There were differences in how successful students were based upon, and there were differences between the first 2 years of the program versus the last 2 years of the program, which makes total sense, but our flow chart didn't have anything to do with that. It just took the classes and divided them up. So that was a project that I worked on that we have implemented. It has made a difference. Has it made a difference in the numbers and what our student success? It's too early to tell that yet, but it has certainly made a difference in how we are advising our students and how we're thinking about student success and really from a personalized level, from, you know, we have students who have a lot going on in their lives other than just going to college. And our flow chart and how we advise students didn't consider that at all previous to this. It was just take the 128-hour program, divide it by, you know, 8 semesters, and try to get them as even as possible from credit hours. And one of the things that this project allowed me to do was just to see that wasn't right. That wasn't doing right by our students. And so getting this data and being able to analyze it in ways that I have never been able to do before allowed me to make changes, to justify those changes to the people that I needed to justify them to. And I can say it has made a difference in our program. Again, is it a successful difference? Time will tell. I find it hard to believe that it won't be.
And so that raises, I guess, just the value of having a system of having access to data. You know, because I think in many cases, faculty and, you know, people who support faculty will have a range of questions. Is this making an impact? Is this working? What should we be doing differently? If you don't have the ability to somewhat readily access a data platform to answer that meaningfully, and that's at an institutional level. Like, you're not going to just go out and say, well, I'll collect data on that myself. It's impossible to do it. So you need that institution level, we'll call it a data lake, swamp, something. So to that end, I'm going to throw it over to Henry, because you've been playing with tools that would make regular humans jump off of small buildings. And so, you know, can you talk a little bit about how did UTA get to the point where it has a data environment that can serve the needs of faculty like Bonnie when they have questions about ensuring student success?
Yeah, so the short answer to how did UTA get here is a story that probably goes back about 15 or 20 years. I'm not going to bore you with it, but there's not really been a single overnight change. It's been a very long, slow, steady process of building up our own internal knowledge and processes of what does our data look like, where does our data live, and over the last, I would say probably 5 or 6 years especially, what kind of reports do we get asked for a lot? What kind of data do we get asked for a lot? To what extent can we start to make that self-service? To what extent can we start automating some of those internal processes? And, you know, sort of tangent off here a little bit, but there's, as we've been going through that process of pushing more and more of our common reports out into self-service dashboards and list reports and the like, I hesitate to use the word arms race, because that's also 2 words, not a word, but I'm going to say it anyways. There's been kind of an arms race between what we're providing and what people are asking for, which, you know, is always a little frustrating for us. The work will never end. I guess the paychecks will never end too, so that's at least good. But as we start putting out more and more reports that are things like, how many students do I have? Which you kind of need to know to run a university. Suddenly our instructors and our chairs and our VPs and our admins, they no longer have to wait for us to provide them that data, and they can now start asking and thinking about much more complicated questions. It's not, how many students do I have? It's, okay, how many students do I have who are at risk of not graduating on time? Once we provide some of that, it's, okay, now why are these students not at risk? And then if we provide that, it's, okay, what can we do about that? And it's going to be this probably never-ending cycle. But coming back to what I think was the initial question at this point, how did UTA get to the point of having this sort of centralized data lake and data service system? It was probably 15 or 20 years of just investment in the infrastructure, in the people, and getting a handle on what our campus actually needs. Every couple of days, we get some new request and realize, ooh, we have more work to do to go collect some data. But also, this is something I'd be interested to hear about, well, I would say from people at other universities, but that's going to have to wait for later because we're all UTA folks. We have also managed to centralize a lot of that work into university analytics. So whenever there's some weird data request that comes in, or someone comes to us with a question about, you know, take your pick of measure of student success, somebody on our team knows about the data we can pull, knows about the person we can ask, and I think that has allowed us to be fairly mobile and able to be pretty responsive to a lot of the needs of campus. So I think I've answered some semblance of the question somewhere in there, but...
Some question I could have asked in a different dimension.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a follow-up question. You can hold it for now, so I'm going to throw it at you and I'll yell loudly. So a faculty member wants to publish at LAC 24, needs data. What does it look like to start working with you to publish say a report that fits in learning sciences, learning analytics, or a paper? How does that happen?
All right, quoting that back in case that wasn't picked up. A faculty member comes to us and says, I want to publish a paper at LAC. What does that look like from our end? Doesn't really look all that different from most of the data requests we get, honestly. If someone comes to us and says, I want to publish about, let's say, student passing rates in computer science course, we treat that like any other data request we would give to the department chair or vice president, with only a couple of exceptions. We anonymize the data for publication, we apply FERPA restrictions and any other privacy regulations that might apply. But as far as we're concerned, that looks like a fairly standard data request or a fairly standard request for help with some analysis, and it goes through our regular channels.
How long does it take from question to getting data?
How long does it take? Well, that depends a lot on the question and a lot on who's asking. So sometimes if it's a request that's of the form, how many students do I have? How many students do I have who are, to what Bonnie said, a transfer student who's at risk of this because their credit hours are below that, and those kind of requests we can typically turn around in probably 2 weeks at the most.
Request for research data.
For research data.
Publish whatever they're asking you for.
Well, again, it still depends on how much they're asking us for, but typically we're very proud of our relatively good turnaround times. If it takes us longer than about 2 or 3 weeks, that's usually because we're having to go back and forth with them to get clarifications, or unfortunately, they ask us for something, we give it to them, they say they wanted something different, rinse and repeat. But the actual data pull part of it, usually on the order of 2 or 3 weeks tops, and that's probably for some of the most complex data set requests we could get.
Over to Bonnie. What was your experience getting data from UT?
Super, super easy. I sent an email. I said, here's what I want. They said, okay. And I don't remember, but I think it was days. I think it was 2 or 3 days. They sent me back. They sent me what I asked for, exactly what I asked for. I did start working with the data, and I had some questions about it. There were things that didn't make sense to me in the data. And I sent a question back, and I just said, this doesn't make sense to me. Why is this? And they worked with me on that. So it was all in all super duper easy and quick from my end.
Well, I'm going to turn the question to Jodi next, because one of the things that Jodi and I have had a number of chats over the duration of the program, and a point that she's made is, well, I want to work with data. I want to do the things that we're supposed to do. In learning analytics, and we've said this right at the start, we've classified it early on, we said it's a bricolage field, which means it comes from here and it comes from here and it comes from here. It bridges multiple areas. You have learning sciences, you have data sciences, you have a technical skill. So for example, last year we ran a year-long Python course for individuals that want it, just peripheral to the master's itself, but just because it's a tool that people increasingly need in that space. And Henry taught that for us with, unfortunately, not fantastic continued turnout, but it's the idea of making these resources available. But so I think I'm going to talk a little bit, this is candid, the experience of you want to learn this combination of conceptual, theoretical, pedagogical, but also technical skills in order to unpack the kinds of questions that Bonnie's talking about. So I'm going to ask Jodi to talk a little bit about her experience from that end and what she thinks an academic program should do to get students up to speed. And then I want to ask Bonnie to bookend that by sharing what she applied from, say, in a program like MSLA in some of the work that you've been doing.
Thanks, George. It's been an interesting experience for me doing the master's program. I'm an implementer. I'm a practitioner. I'm not an academic. So making that switch in many ways of thinking using a different mindset than I usually have to take this program. I'm really grateful for all the different courses that have been done, but my thing is, and I'm also an instructional designer, is okay, great, here's your theory, here's the what. But what about the how? How do you apply what we've been learning? So for example, when we did R, we used data sets that I'm sure anyone who does data are very familiar with. But we could have used data from somebody's research paper and used that and gone through the process. The same thing with a couple other data courses that we've had. In terms of which course? Go on. For me, it's always the application of it because I'm the implementer. And I think that's where I'm, trying to figure out now, okay, I learned all this but how do I turn it into something that's actionable? So I think that's going to be a transition. And it's not necessarily about like, how do you use a specific tool like Python? It's more about here's the data set and how do you analyze that data set? And that's the skill that I would like to continue to focus on is, okay, what are the questions that could be asked? Give me the question that was asked. Can I find the data to be able to support it? Or I can look at the data, know what the problem is, and think of the questions that I can solve it. That's the part that I would really like to add is actually analyzing data sets and understanding how to use them and then apply them. So once you have the data, how do you apply it back to the classroom? Because ultimately, that's what I want to be able to do.
So I have applied kind of what I've learned really almost by replicating. The thing that I did with looking at the student semester hours and how successful they were, I read something very similar in one of the papers that I read for the class, and I thought, oh, this is something that I could possibly replicate. So that's how I've gone about applying, and again, the list of things that I would like to do in the future all come from that. I will say to kind of what you said about being a practitioner, somebody said to me after I did a presentation for one of my classes, they said, oh, it's obvious that you're a practitioner. And I don't know that it was meant as an insult. Maybe I took it a little bit that way. But I think it's a strength. I think it's a strength that people on your campus have that aren't in analytics or aren't in learning analytics. You have a lot of people like me who have control. I have control over our program. I mean, I can change whatever I want to change and I'm begging for ways to say, here's how to make our students more successful. And, I'm not a researcher. 0% of my workload is research. It's teaching, it's administration, it's service. So I don't have the time to do a lot of really focused research, but I have the students, and I have, again, the important thing is I can control what happens, not just for a class, but for a whole program. And I see kind of a lack of program level analytics. There seem to be a lot of institutional level analytics and a lot of specific course level analytics, but I think a big area that we could really make a lot of improvement on is at the program level. And you have people in programs that have control over that and can make changes, not just for a course, but for a whole program, which affects a lot of students.
And that raises an important aspect, which is there's a coevolution, or should be at least, between the research outputs that happen at LAC and related venues and the actual capacity for improving activity and success at a teacher level or a classroom level. And I don't know if those are always coupled, because they should be. I mean, ideally, the effects of research outputs at LAC, if it's meaningful to develop a scientific field that sits in a social education learning space, then you would think that the eventual application of it is equally critical, or put another way, it's the second half of the research question. If we put out, we've got 1 million and some downloads on the LAC conference proceedings, and if the primary output is a whole bunch of people got a whole bunch of citations and we didn't necessarily advance student performance success significantly, have we achieved what we needed to have achieved? So I'm going to throw that question over to Anna now. I know you've been working with University Analytics. If you could maybe talk a little bit about some of the work that you're doing, the research, and again, I'm trying to get at that research-practice divide.
So I think me and Henry, we worked on many different projects, and So how it usually looks like is like, for example, I'm doing some data collection part. He's usually doing some kind of NLP stuff that I might need. For example, if I collect some social media data, he can maybe get some sentiments, emotions, or any kind of stuff like that. And we are trying to find some correlations between, let's say, vaccination rates at the state level and then sentiments and emotions of these social media posts. For example, our negative posts on social media may be triggering lower vaccination rates in some areas. So we have to perform some kind of deep data analysis to find out what is going on. But what we are hoping for, as you're saying, from like that practice and output stuff, is what we are hoping for is that some public health, I guess, department are going to look at our data and our output, and they're actually going to do something about it. As you're saying, like research is, the main point of research is to actually use the output and the results to improve whatever the problem is. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but...
When you're working with Henry, are you working primarily with existing data that you have, or is he helping you also be part of the data collection process?
Usually data collection is something I'm doing most of the stuff, most of the times, but he's actually the one who is, I guess, giving me some valuable insights into the data. That makes sense. He can explain better.
Yeah, I'll throw my 2 cents in here. So the work that I've been doing with Anna for the last year or so, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah, has been kind of part of what I mentioned earlier about UA's attempt to just generally broaden the scope of data analysis on campus, even outside of a learning analytics lens. So Anna and some of the researchers that she works with over in our public health school had some really interesting research questions that both Pete and I thought were really, really cool and we wanted to get in on. We were involved in some of the early discussions around data collection to sort of help guide some of their thinking just based on our experiences working with people like Jodi and Bonnie and others around campus, just to get a sense of, well, here's your question. You want to learn about the relationship between vaccination rates and something on social media. What kind of stuff do you need to collect? But then Anna kind of went off and collected all that data. It's a really cool data set, y'all. But my role was primarily to serve almost in an advisory capacity, I would say. And it was quite interesting from sort of my perspective, having come from UA, where as much as we also really want to make sure that the data we're providing, the analyses we're providing are actually helping out our students, because otherwise what are we doing with our lives? It's a little less common than it used to be, but we will still provide something to a client and then we just kind of don't hear anything after that. There's only been a few projects recently where we're kind of involved in the long-term assessment and feedback loops, but getting involved with some of the work that Anna's doing in public health was kind of a bit eye-opening. It's actually changed a little bit of at least my thinking on sort of our role staying involved a little more long-term with these projects. So I kind of took that in a different direction. So I hand this back before I go too further afield.
All right, so if some of you have questions in the audience, feel free to raise your hands. We'd love to hear sort of what you're experiencing within your own institutions or questions that you might have. So at any point, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll just keep randomly having a chat here. So I think, was there a question? Yeah, go ahead. You know what, I might. This is a weird arrangement doing it this way, but we have an expansive classroom.
Thank you. Yoram Kelman from the Open University of Israel. 2 small questions. IRB, do you work with vis-a-vis the IRB, or if the data comes from you, is that already covered? And then there's the institutional culture question. How do you, once you release the data, people will also misuse it, to compare oranges to apples, be unaware of bias that might be, analyze it in a way that introduces bias. How do you deal with these issues? Thank you.
All right, so let's start with Henry. The IRB one I'm going to drop over to you because I know you've both played a little bit, at least in the front of it, but...
Very interesting set of questions there. So I'll chime in a little bit with IRB. So when someone comes to us to ask for research or data for a research project, we basically just ask them, like, show us your IRB approval, and then we sort of take it from there. If we need to get clarifications, we'll talk with them and IRB, but we pretty much let the data requester worry about that step. As for the misuse of data question or misapplication of data, we have run into a very, very small amount of that in the past. Mostly in our experience when that's happened, it's because we've provided something that's not quite exactly what was asked for. So someone might ask, so like Bonnie might come to us and say, I want to know about, let's say, passing rates of transfer students versus URM students versus FTIC in some class. And if we just provide her a big list of students, that's kind of one step away from the question she actually asked. And so there's a chance for that sort of miscommunication to lead to maybe her doing some analysis herself that maybe misses some of the really technical nuances of our data definitions around who exactly is a student or an FTIC student. The way we've been working to kind of close that gap and make sure that we're providing data that answers the question that was asked and only the question that was asked is largely just a lot of back and forth with the data requester. We'll pull together some kind of minimal viable product, present it to them, with all sorts of labels saying, draft, do not share, this is for internal use only, please give it back to us, no, really, please. Make sure it's what they need. If it's not, we sort of iteratively tweak and adjust. And during the course of that series of back and forths, we make sure that we convey very clearly what this data does and does not show them, and try and use that as an opportunity to train them on it. Because the couple of instances we've seen throughout the past few years have never really been malicious. It's mostly just been an issue of, well, somewhere there was a bit of a communication breakdown on what we're actually providing. But I think we've been making quite a lot of strides towards eliminating those gaps altogether. I'm going to pass over to here now.
Do you have, no. I did, when I requested my data, they asked me if I were going to use it for publish purposes. I was not. I was just using it for our own internal me to try to improve the program. So I did not need to get IRB for that. I also told them they could anonymize it because I didn't need to know student IDs. So that was all anonymized. But I did not need IRB simply because I wasn't going to publish anything.
Now, in retrospect, would you, because you look at some of those results, it's always a difficulty, and you're, because this is something, we've had people in the MSLA program, it's an ongoing discussion. We have, for many individuals that are in learning analytics, not everybody wants to be an academic teaching about learning analytics or even researching about it. In fact, I would say that's a minority. A lot of the students that we engage with, they might be school teachers. They might be people we have in a corporate education setting or in a nonprofit or an NGO where they're doing work that needs to work with data. Most of the papers that we've selected, this is an early on thing, so the program is a couple of years old now, and at the start you're like, hey, you know what? People would like to know what I know. And then you realize later, not really. A lot of times they're like, I really don't give a crap what you think I should read. I want to know how to do X. And I'm like, well, look at this lovely paper. And they're like, so we've had a few changes. It's an interesting code design that evolves with your cohorts as they come through, where you're like, oh, okay, maybe instead of a paper, we're going to do an interview with someone, or maybe we're going to bring this on. So anyway, I just flag there's a little bit of a backdrop. So the IRB question with things like this, institutionally is very relevant, but I always feel that we talk about how does research get applied for practice. And I'm just going to nudge gently to Bonnie. Maybe part of the question also is how does practice get turned into research? Because there's a corresponding relationship there that might result in you had an experience, you got good insight into the experience of students, maybe there's something that could also be fed into the community. I will say for LAC in general, we've had practitioner sort of stream as well. In the past, we had not fantastic paper turnout. It was tweaked this year to make it less onerous because, surprise, surprise, practitioners don't like to write like researchers. And if you ask them to write a research paper, you're going to not necessarily get that contribution. So anyway, an interesting side, I just want to highlight something that you've been involved with, Jodi, because we sometimes hear a lot of the papers that you see at an event like this have a uniquely sort of Western-centric view. Local universities, there is a growing cohort internationally, if you saw Bart's opening slides today on that participation. But I just want Jodi to talk a little bit about a project that she was involved with this year with a group of learners out of Africa and partnering with a prof out of South Africa on this project as well. But maybe you just talk a little bit about what that is and was to try and get at this. Great, we're doing work within a system, and yet we are situated with this global community of learning scientists, learning analysts, educational data mining people. What does that look like when we start to reach outside of our institutions and our countries?
So I was involved with a project with the professor, Paul. I hope he's on there. He said he was going to be. Thank you. Hey, Paul. Thank you. I'm very interested. It's kind of a follow-on to what do we need to learn? What do we need to know in learning analytics? It doesn't really matter if you're an academic or your implementer or whatever your your T-shaped type thing is. We need to know a broad amount, and then everybody's going to have their specialization. So I'm very interested in competencies, and I work on a couple other frameworks. So I've started, ever since we began, my first question to George and Justin was like, is there a learning analytics competency framework? They're like, no. So for several of my classes, I've been really working on that. And then through an independent study that we had in the fall, I was actually able to apply it. This is part of SOLAR, the African Network for Learning Analytics and Research, was just formed last year, and it's now an official network under the SOLAR. And there was about 100 people that signed up. And so when I was talking to Paul, I'm like, well, what skills do they have? What do they know? Is it any different from anybody else? So I, did the research and came up with a lot of different competency frameworks from the different areas that we keep talking about, whether it's the data science or whether it's learning sciences or instructional design, and then reviewed them and came up with a survey to survey these people. It was very interesting, though. So we were really happy. There was about 100 people that were part of the network at that point, and we got like 2/3 of the people who responded. So A, we were very excited about that. And then B, what was interesting, once we got the data, first of all, we realized, well, these people already know a lot about learning analytics. So a lot of the skills that I didn't think people would have, they already did because they're at higher institutions. But then also interpreting that information. So, for example, we asked, okay, do you use digital tools in your classroom? And realizing, well, if they use an LMS, that to them is a digital tool, which it absolutely is. But there's so many more, applications and technologies that we use. And then, of course, they're dealing with issues, around a lack of electricity and the internet and taking those types of things into consideration. So it's been really exploratory about working with them, and then all the things that they really want to learn about, which are very similar to the things that we all want to learn about. And we're going to continue to work with that group and continue to look at the competencies for learning analytics. Thanks.
Great, and we actually have got a question at the back. I'll walk up there while I randomly talk. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is there's a growing number of Master of Science or Masters in Learning Analytics in general occurring. I guess I'm kind of the disembodied voice. Ooh, you're going to, and then I'll come right up. Anyway, so, okay, but one of the things we've got, we had initially a workshop that didn't hit the target because Grace runs a really tight ship at Solar. Like if we were all on an island, there's a few of us that wouldn't make it. But anyway, so we had a discussion. We wanted to talk about what are the academic programs that are doing work with learning analytics. We started this actually several years ago. We hosted an event at CMU, and we talked about what does a Master of Science or a Master of Learning Analytics look like? What are the competencies? What are the capabilities? And how do we do it? Because there's things like an open data science master's or a master's. So I was thinking, well, what if we had a Master's in Learning Analytics that was open, at least had a competency framework, even if it didn't have all the specific literacy details. I think that's a part of Jodi's work that I know is still unfolding and ongoing, but I think it's really critical that fields such as, again, I see educational data mining, learning analytics, AI ed increasing with some of those dynamics, quite consequential. I'm going to walk up here. No worries.
Hello, my name is Ayat Sakini. I'm from Phoenix. I just need to know how to engage with universities, not let's say in the western side. Since learning analytics is not familiar over there, let's say Middle East or other countries, if there is like a specific like communities we can like join. Any suggestions? Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So the question was just, are there other communities that are not, based out of, say, traditional American, Australian, European regions? That is an area of focus with Solar, and I would definitely encourage you to pick the conversation up with that executive. I know there is a Latin American learning analytics community going on. I know there's growing interest in the Middle East around learning analytics. I've had a few meetings with different, minister-level organizations around deployment of learning analytics within those environments. What you just mentioned around the African Learning Analytics Network as well. So I think while much of the idea of learning analytics initially was available to organizations that already had the resources to teach digitally, because you need the digital environment to get the data. If you're in regions where you don't, as Jodi noted, there are parts of the world where electricity is a going concern. Like you're not always sure if that, so it's kind of hard to be deep in the learning analytics space when you're asking, am I going to have electricity? But I think in many levels, there is a type of datafication that's happening corresponding with digitization globally. And so there are those communities emerging and developing. But that's definitely a broader conversation that you should pick up. I encourage you with the Solar exec, look at the organization on the website and other resources that are available in that regard. Anybody here have a comment on that or engaged in it that has a better overview of the specific implementations? Okay.
I'd be fascinated to hear anything that comes out of that.
One last thing, it's not just about the digital data that you can get. I mean, there's still a lot of paper, and Paul can talk to a lot about that and the use of paper and how we can use that data even to get one or two things that we can use to be able to adapt and improve the economy and classroom. So we still use a lot of paper.
Okay, any other questions from audience members? I've got about another, 10 minutes. I'm going to start eating this. Look at how cool I am. You guys have no idea.
Thank you. Ludo van Meeuwen from the Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. And good to hear as far as you are with implementing learning analytics at this university. And I'm eager to learn, of course, how you did that. And you've told already a lot. And there's two questions that I think would be very beneficial for me to have the answer on is, who drives the direction in this university where to go to with learning analytics? I hear you want to do more with learning analytics and with dashboarding probably towards the students. Who decides that and who drives this roadmap? And the second one is, do you feel you need a more safeguarding on this direction, for example, by ethical board, students board, next to the more ad hoc ERB, as I heard already, which is good that it's involved, but that is just ad hoc on several projects, but not on the overarching and overall data use. So driving and safeguarding, how do you see that, and would you benefit from that?
Thank you. I'm going to try a dry run at that. Henry, do you want to answer that a bit or not? Okay, so I'm going to just say, first of all, who drives? I think with any organization, there's always going to be a relationship to, what do you have for tool sets that are available, right? So if you're partnering with someone like Civitas, you may have tools or nudging available, tool sets available that you might not have if you don't have as a platform. I think, Professor Pete Smith sometimes has difficulty finding his office, but the security will lead him there, which is fantastic. But I think he largely leads and drives, what happens at an analytics level on campus, because he has that overview of what's happening across the entire space of different tool sets and interfaces with the institutional providers and so on. So I'm going to ask Henry to respond to that, and I'm going to ask Pete as well to just reply to that somewhat.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Thank you. So as far as, at least from my perspective, and again, the other UA folks floating around the conference will probably have a slightly different answer. In terms of who's driving learning analytics on UTA's campus, it's kind of a mix. So we have a lot of data requests that are kind of very nuts and bolts of running an institution. How many students do I have? What's my revenue look like? How many instructors do I have? We have tried to do tried to sort of shift some of those questions in a more learning analytics direction internally. Sometimes we get a little bit of pushback because, based on timelines or maybe piece of regulation or mandatory reporting, that may not be super appropriate. But we've noticed a shift over the last couple of years as we've been doing that some of the people who tend to ask us for a lot of data and a lot of analysis have started to ask us things that look a little more like learning analytics and a little bit less like traditional business reporting. So it's a little bit the people outside of UA, and a little bit us in UA kind of sneakily playing, don't know if I should say playing mind games on them. I am being recorded after all. But as for the question about safeguards and things of that nature, I will freely admit I'm caught a little bit off guard by that question. I don't know that I've put a huge amount of thought towards that, but certainly in principle, I would agree that safeguards and ethical standards and something like an IRB for day-to-day operations would certainly not be a bad idea. But I'm somewhat embarrassed to admit I have perhaps not thought that question through well enough to be able to articulate an answer. Maybe Pete will show me up on this. I certainly hope so.
Well, and I think one point I just want to emphasize briefly on that too is I think with most practices institutionally, as you're aware of, IRB is sort of the token clearing of ethics when it comes to research. I think there's a self-policing that happens. We've always had the view, at least on campus I've been involved in, if you're using to improve the organization or to improve organizational practices, it doesn't need IRB clearance. But I think more and more, especially when you start talking about AI and the growing influence that might start to have, there's a secondary thing which relates to bias and fairness and ethics in general, rather than just strictly ethics around the research pool that you're dealing with. Another thing that's fascinating around that, and I think why Henry, and I think justifiably, I don't think Henry's response is unusual. I think many universities would respond in a comparable way to say, hey, we've got an IRB system that protects researcher and research subjects, but there's the sense that the data that we collect as individuals move through our programs, that data does not necessarily, we don't see the end user. When you sit down with a student, you interview them in a controlled or an experimental setting, there's an immediate ethics dynamic there. There is a trail ethics that comes by when you have data that may have been collected over years. And so when you look at that, we don't have the same, and I would classify that almost less like an ethics question, even though it's tied to it, but it's primarily a data governance question. But I do think at some point, as more and more of the AI influence comes in, a data-centric IRB-like process would not be an unreasonable thing to expect on more campuses. So Pete, either the leadership, where do you get your ideas and direction from, or the governance one?
An emerging trend about leadership here is the notion that many universities have a strategic plan. If you've been through that process, you're probably about to roll your eyes at me. We are entering a fourth or fifth cycle of our strategic plan in the past 20 years. We are going to have a data management or data strategic plan as a subpart of that. We will be developing as a campus. Henry's exactly right. In the past, that direction has come from us as an institution, possibly driven, mostly driven by a president, provost, CFO. We are going to instantiate that into a strategic plan with our own strategic plan that fits the business model and the strategic direction of the university. That's something you can think about. There are models out there. We're willing to share the models we find it to be an emerging trend. The other is relative to best practices. We go immediately to IRB in the academic setting, but in the data science world, if you look at our shop as a data science shop, there are audit bodies, there are best standards and practices. We use the IIA, International Institute for Analytics. We highly recommend them. They have a very business focus. They're out there accrediting the data science shop at Campbell Soup or a large hospital chain or Exxon. And we are going to undergo an audit by them in the next year. It will not be precisely tailored to the academic setting. It will have some tailoring, but the notion that we may not have an emerging set of best practices universities has caused us to move out to the larger data science world, the larger business and nonprofit world.
Thank you. And I think there was a question up at the back. Is that right? Okay, I'm going to come up there and then we're going to go do a quick summary from each of the panelists and then we will all go probably consume beverages.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Becky Matz. I'm from the University of Michigan. This question is kind of directed towards, I think, Bonnie and then Black. Okay. I was interested in what you were saying. There's a lot of institutional reporting and kind of course level reporting, and that middle layer of like departmental or unit level or program level reporting is sort of a missing feature. And we've been trying to work on something to help that at Michigan. And we've struggled a little bit with like static versus dashboard kind of presentation. And then I was trolling around on your University Analytics website, and right there on the reports page, there's like the dashboard section and the predefined report section. And so I just wondered if you or any of you on the panel could kind of talk about like when you're making the choice to either to use or produce a new set of data, in some kind of compact fashion, like what are you thinking about? Is it what are you thinking about when it's static versus more dynamic?
All right, I will walk down. We'll make a note next year. Don't have as many stairs or have more mics. As I was doing push-ups all afternoon.
So I'll admit what I think about is who I'm trying to make happy. That's what I think about is, the two main, well, I guess there's three. There's the accreditation side of things and what our accreditors want to see, which is right now static. That's what they want. They're not looking at anything dynamic. They come in, once a year, one of them, and once every 6 years and say, give me a snapshot of what's going on. Just internally, we have kind of mocked up some things, a dashboard looking thing, but to be honest, at least for us, things don't change often enough for that to really make any sense. I feel like we try to be very proactive and not stuck, but we move slowly, so I think for us, just because of that, static right now just makes more sense.
So I'm going to move to wrap up. So you got 30 seconds and then pass it down.
Okay. Every dashboard and every report on the University Analytics website is either automatically refreshed every single night with new data, or it does a fresh data pull whenever you click the Give Me the Data button. That's kind of just been what we've standardized on for all of our self-service stuff. It sort of takes it out of our hands as to whether or not it's a sort of static or a live dashboard, because they're all technically live. But like Jodi was saying, or Bonnie was saying, sorry, depending on the particular data source we're pulling from, some of our data sources, like how many students have applied to the university, that data source updates daily. Some things like how many students were admitted for the fall 2022 class, that basically becomes a static data set at some point. So that's mostly thrust off onto the underlying data rather than a decision we make at the dashboard reporting level.
A couple of summary concluding thoughts.
Well, I would just like to say that collaboration with somebody from University Analytics can be really helpful to students like me. So I hope that the skills that you develop during the years working for University Analytics can be used, maybe if you have time, to help some other students who are engaged in this kind of research and they're trying to answer different research questions, because you guys are great mentors. So keep it up.
So I would just like to say that I appreciate this community. I'm new to the community and I appreciate it. I think that people like me who are on the wrong side of the hill can be a great asset, really. I mean, I have a lot of people like me have a lot of experience in the classroom and at the program level, and we still want to learn and we still want to collaborate. And I know I have become an asset to my department because of the things I've learned in this program, and I've become an asset to the college. I've had colleagues from other departments in the college reach out to me and say, hey, I hear you're learning about this. Can you help me with my grant? So I think there's something to be said about not just researching, but also the practical applications of what you guys do, and I appreciate you.
Jodi, take it home.
I continue to further my work with Paul and with George in terms of figuring out what are those skills and competencies and knowledge that people should have either in this graduate programs and especially in the African context for K through 12. So how can we adapt that and take all the different things that we've been learning and put it in a context that makes sense to people so we can start implementing in other parts of the world in lower resource environments.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks everyone for attending. We had a bigger group online. I don't think we got to a lot of those comments, but thank you for your questions and certainly thanks to the panelists for great responses. Take care.